Hey, I'm Sebastian Castro, and I would like to talk about something that doesn't get talked about a lot. And thanks to Rappler, I have a little bit of a chance to air some of my thoughts. It's been less than a month since the Kitapawan massacre, where 5,000 farmers marched, 2 farmers were killed, and 70 were wounded. Some of the short-term causes, immediate causes, were definitely El Nino, which is a byproduct of climate change. But if we're going to talk about long-term causes, I would argue that the failure of land distribution is one of the reasons why we have experienced this massacre among so many. So my main question today is, does the Philippines need land distribution? But first, let's talk about the history of the Philippines, this issue, and the Philippines' demographics around this issue. There's actually been 11 agrarian reform laws spanning the better part of a century. And 2 of the most recent ones will happen to be the Mendiola Massacre in '87 and the 2004 Sinalucita Massacre. Both of these massacres have had Sinalucita farmers killed, which is noticeable because Sinalucita happens to be where our sitting president, Pinoy, grew up. Again, there's actually no land reform program right now. Since June 30 of 2014, CARPER had expired. So now let's talk a little bit about the Philippines demographics to explain why this matters. The Philippines is a very bio-rich country, rich in natural resources. 5th most mineralized in the world, 5th in gold, 4th in copper, 5th in nickel. It's so rich in natural resources that the wealth of natural resources in itself could pay 14 to 17 times of our national debt to the IMF. As of 2013, 1/3 of our total workforce are farmers tillers, essentially rural workers. 1/3 of our population basically is affected by what happens in terms of agrarian reform. So all these statistics that tell us how rich we are in natural resources confronts a very sad fact. We don't have food insecurity. As of now, we literally import rice. We cannot feed ourselves. And it's very daunting, all these facts considered, and considering that DAR estimates that all of 9.7 million hectares of agricultural lands exist in this country. And that would be a modest estimate by the government itself. Why is this the case? We have to also address the fact that the concentration of wealth is so skewed. According to DAR data, 60% of total agricultural lands are owned by 13% of landowners. You can see this in display on the infographic, where it showcases some of the largest tracts of land owned by single individual landowners. Hacienda Luisita is a prime example where you have a 6,000 hectare property and by estimates comparably the size of Manila and Makati combined. But that's not even anywhere close to the biggest, because when you look at Dandinco Huancos, far and away the largest, you're talking about 30,000 hectares. That's a lot of Manilas. And then that's only half of the conversation, because then there's multinational corporations who own so much of our land. Dole, Del Monte, Nestle, Monsanto when it comes to seed monopolies, Bayer in terms of agricultural influence. These, a single one can own as much as 100,000 hectares of our land. So more to the point, it's no secret that a handful of political dynasties have monopolized land all across this country on top of multinational corporations. So it's no secret that a handful of political dynasties have completely monopolized the land across our country, along with multinational corporations. That's the problem. Then the question is, what's the solution? CARPER and GARB. CARPER and GARB are the name of the 2 different pieces of legislation to respond to land distribution. CARPER stands for Comprehensive Agrarian Program with Extensions Reform, and GARB would be Genuine Agrarian Reform Bill, otherwise known as HB 252. There are 2 different factions pushing for this, factions that belong to the left, and understanding a little bit about both helps you understand the laws themselves. Before I even begin discussing CARPER, I'm going to make a little bit clear that the version of CARPER that came into law is not necessarily the version that its proponents intended, which I think is worth citing. To CARPER's credit, it did away with some of the original loopholes in CARP, most notably the stock distribution option. It's a little bit difficult to summarize CARPER because there's a great deal of disagreement in terms of how much land has actually been distributed under DAR. Oftentimes, the land that is distributed finds its way back into the control of political dynasties and multinational corporations, which completely skews a lot of statistics you're going to find. But one very telling statistic is that according to DAR itself, the percentage of farmers who are unable to pay the amortization fee and actually receive land titles, the amount who do not receive land titles is 98% as of now, 6 years since its passing. Criticisms of CARPER. One of the biggest criticisms is that they force the farmers to pay for it. Farmers would be required to pay amortization fees to the land bank for a period of 30 years. The amount would depend on the value of the land, and in the case that farmers' beneficiaries fail to pay for a period of 3 years, their CLOAs are completely revoked. And as CARPER states, they would be permanently disqualified from being a beneficiary. So it is very hard to begin with for a farmer who has so little immediate resources to make these payments because he's required to actually pay for the thing. Another criticism, Section 35, Amendment 2 of the original CARP, which essentially partners the private sector with the government. Under CARPER, it also allowed local government units to convert agricultural lands into anything that they saw fit, being as long as it was profitable. Now, this is supposed to be for the benefit of farmers. The argument would be that somehow they will give more resources to the farmers that they don't have. But in reality, this is really just a way for multinational corporations to circumvent the 60-40 rule in the Constitution. It's a loophole. And yet another criticism of CARPER would have to be Section 5, which its own lead proponent, Walden Bello, the representative of Akbayan, lamented. It's Section 5 that essentially gave landowners vetoing powers, essentially allowed them to decide who would be the farmer beneficiaries, meaning they could flat out deny their own tenants. As Walden has been quoted, Section 5, the phrase attested by the landowners within Section 5 would essentially give the latter veto power over who would receive land, allowing him to, among other things, select relatives or compliant tenants as beneficiaries. Section 24 further allows farmers to be criminalized for insisting their right to land after they've already been denied. If you're not approved by the landowners and you insist to benefit from the distribution, you can actually be penalized. I suppose it's very telling that even Walden Bello, one of the main proponents again of CARPER, has conceded that it wasn't a perfect bill, especially after the amendment process took place. The argument for CARPER has always been that it's better we have something now rather than no agrarian reform bill at all. But that's pretty sad considering that there has always been a more progressive option, which would be GARB, otherwise known as HB 3059, HB 374 before HB 252, because it's been through so many congressional hearings, it never has gone that far. The biggest difference between CARPER and GARB would be that GARB distributes land for free, under the one condition that you continue to till the land you own, under the condition that you can't sell it. But the land would be yours to work on. As early as now, I want to go ahead and address what this is. GARB is essentially calling for the forced distribution of land. It's asking for land to be forcibly removed from land-owning elite clans. Jacques, I just think that point has to be understood so you understand what the argument for that is. At first glance, many call it unconstitutional, saying that current property rights now should never be touched because they're that sacred. But as we've covered just earlier, you're talking about inequality that is tremendous. So what is the argument for giving farmer beneficiaries land without the right to sell it? Why should land be forcibly removed from land-owning elite clans who own it? Historically, if farmers are allowed to sell their own land, they will because they have not been given enough support services to actually make use of it. They do not have the option, in other words. Support services are something specified in GARB, something outlined in great detail. Also worth considering is exactly how much it takes a farmer to get to a point where he's actually benefiting from his land. After he's received land, estimates hold that it would take 6 months for him to be able to harvest it, along with 40,000 pesos in support services. That includes irrigation, inputs, seeds, fertilizers, pesticides if needed, machineries, tractors, threshers. And then, of course, there's infrastructure, which is something that plays into this entire process. So the main argument would be that history has proven there is no faster way for a country with the Philippines' demographics to develop. After the better part of a century, after 11 failed agricultural reform programs, history has proved that the second you begin compromising, you have already lost. The argument for progressive legislation like GARB is also part of growing global inequality. 62 billionaires currently own as much wealth as half of the world's population. I have to repeat that. 62 billionaires currently own as much wealth as half of the world's population. Inequality has been growing worldwide, globally. We know this, we see this. But how much of it is sustainable? At what point? You have other elements into play. Climate change. We've seen the effects of Yolanda. All these things into consideration, is it not worth considering that just maybe distributing land to those who need it most might do more? So I'd like to invite all of you guys into a Twitter discussion. I don't know the exact time and date, but the details are apparently right here. That's the date, that's the time, that's the hashtag. I will be there. I know I have a lot of friends on Twitter that will be joining me, and I can't wait to see you guys there. So the main argument would be that history has proven there is no faster way for a country with the Philippines' demographics to develop. After the better part of a century, after 11 failed agricultural reform programs, history has proved that the second you begin compromising, you have already lost. And all this is just part and parcel of growing global inequality. You have leading economists like Thomas Piketty, who through exhaustive work show us just how much global inequality has been growing for generations. Where now 62 billionaires currently own as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. And I think it just requires that we take some pause into asking why we have so much growth that is not inclusive. Last night I watched the VP debate, and there was a question by CNN asking the Philippine vice presidential candidates, which of you and how do you plan to sustain Aquino's economic growth? My first immediate reaction was, you are asking how we will sustain growth that has not even been inclusive to begin with. After the Kitapawan massacre, I deeply hope that we all take into consideration that there are avenues that lead to sustained growth that history has long proven. And with other impending factors like climate change, I don't see how we can afford not to take them. So I'd like to invite all of you guys into a Twitter discussion. I don't know the exact time and date, but the details are apparently right here. That's the date, that's the time, that's the hashtag. I will be there. I know I have a lot of friends on Twitter that will be joining me, and I can't wait to see you guys there.